Hello and welcome to Research Methods. This is week 11 for us, and we have spent most of our time thus far this semester looking at quantitative information. Now we're going to turn our attention to qualitative articles and a little bit deeper, in-depth analysis of how do we look at and critique qualitative articles so that we can use them for evidence-based practice as well. So hopefully by the end of this week's lesson, you'll be able to identify various types of qualitative methodology, as well as have a little bit more knowledge about how to critique them more in depth. How can you tell if they are trustworthy or not, which is the word used for validity when it comes to qualitative research. A little bit of housekeeping. So we have some announcements here. Just be paying attention to what's going on in the syllabus and what is due when. But why qualitative? Why do we need to have qualitative research? So historically, in occupational therapy, we actually started with qualitative research, basically case-based or case study research. We would look at a case in depth, look at the intervention that was provided, and look at maybe why it worked or what the person was saying about why it worked. And then we would present that as evidence in the literature, and I'm talking about like in the 40s and 50s. And then occupational therapists could use that information to then design their own interventions based on what they were reading about for particular cases. Well, when occupational science came along, kind of in the 70s and 80s, we went a little more into the quantitative realm of things to examine what is occupation, why is occupation important, and how do we go about facilitating occupation with people. And we got some more generalizable information. But we've kind of swung back around to needing this qualitative piece as well. Why would we need that? Well, because while quantitative tells us more about the what, qualitative tells us more about the why and the how. So it answers questions that are a little more into kind of the behind the scenes information. So what factors cause adherence? We can measure adherence to treatment protocols using quantitative data, but why? Why are they adhering or not adhering? We can use qualitative information to find that out. Or what's the experience? What's it like to have something go wrong with your system, and how does it impact your everyday occupations? So maybe not so much like the intervention piece, but let's get an insight and understanding so that we can be more client-centered with our interventions with our clients. Or things like, how does the stigma of intellectual disability impact behavior in that particular population? And then why won't people comply with home programs? What are some of the whys behind that? So there are many different types of qualitative studies, and here I've provided a listing of just a few. And I'm going to have you explore the definitions of each of these in an activity in class, and I'll be providing that for you. We also get into this a little bit more in depth next semester. But for right now, what I want you to understand is, while all qualitative studies are looking at the why and the experience and sort of the meaning of what goes on in occupation, there are different ways of looking at it. So in general, grounded theory helps us create a word-based theory or structure, sometimes a visual, of why certain things exist. Phenomenology just examines the lived experience that people have. So it's asking people more about what is the experience, and sometimes it examines texts or interviews or focus groups. Sometimes it involves observations. Ethnography is much more observation-based because ethnography is about participating in a particular culture and observing it from the inside. So this might be an ethnic group. It could be a work group. There was an occupational therapy study done where someone got on the inside of an occupational therapy clinic-based work group and looked at a particular aspect of their work. And they used ethnography to be able to do that. The good old case study research, where we get inside a particular case. Kind of a little caveat to this is that a case can be a person, an individual, but it can also be a group, an organization, an institution, It can be a particular instance of something that occurs, let's say a time-based intervention, a 2-week camp, so to speak. So those are some other ways of looking at a case study besides just looking at a person. Narrative study is, I think of it almost as a type of phenomenology, although it has sort of its own methodology. It is looking at the stories people tell or the stories we tell ourselves. And some of my favorite narrative studies were into the clinical reasoning of occupational therapists. And to me, it was sort of a eureka moment of here's how occupational therapists think. We tell ourselves stories about our clients and then use those stories to develop a picture of their lives that help us to be client-based and help us to create interventions that are tailored to their specific needs. And it's very story-based. And it sort of rung true for me when I read that narrative study, and that was back in the 90s. So we'll talk a little bit more about narrative studies. Participatory action are where the participants themselves get involved in actually making a change. And this can be anything from social movements, which is where it kind of came from, to things like participants in a fall prevention study actually take part in leading the fall prevention and in providing their own tips and tricks based on what they've learned in life. Then critical theory, which I think in today's climate tends to get politicized a little bit, but it's really not. Critical theory is just saying that not every truth rings true for everybody. That cultures and groups create their own basis of truth. Based on critical elements within that truth. So say, for example, we know that occupation differs in the United States than it does, say, in an Asian culture. In the United States, we are very independent focused. People want to be independent. They want to go home alone. They want to be able to take care of themselves independently. Whereas in Asian cultures, it's more about interdependence. How can I reintegrate myself into this culture that I've been separated from because of this disability? I can't get around in the community. I can't participate with my family. I can't be in the places or be with the people that I used to be with. And it's much more about interdependence than it is about independence. That's actually critical theory. Critical theory can examine disparities and differences related to socioeconomic class and other critical factors. But it just basically is about looking at the differences in how people understand meaning based on the groups and the environments and the social context that they're in. So that's a little bit about critical theory. Let's talk about some common features of all of those types of qualitative research. That these kind of go throughout any one of these traditions. They each have their own process for data collection and data analysis, but here's some of the things they have in common. They have what's called an iterative data gathering. In other words, back and forth. They don't just go collect their data one time and then analyze it. They go back and forth between the data gathering and the data analyzing process. So they might gather some interviews and look at those interviews and say, well, here's some themes related to that. They might then go back and gather some more interviews. Or if it's a type of study that doesn't collect more interviews, they might go back to the data and see if their themes are holding true throughout various different texts that they have. Qualitative inquiry also uses various steps of verification, and these are different from what you would use in quantitative. You might see data triangulation, in other words, various forms of data collection. It's not just interviews, but we might also have a questionnaire. We might also have some observation. We might also be taking our own memos. We also have multiple readings and multiple reviewers. It's usually not considered rigorous enough if you have just one researcher in qualitative research. We also have member checking, where we go back to the people who gave us the information in the first place and ask them, did we get this right? Excuse me. We also have thick description, where we go into great detail to describe the text that we got. And we use quotes and excerpts to support our analysis, to kind of back up the thick description that we're writing. And we're also focusing on writing a description of an experience rather than manipulating an outcome. Rather than providing an intervention and then see if it made a change, we're just trying to describe something. So how do we know if qualitative studies are good? What makes them trustworthy? Well, here are some of the things. We can also look at our Johns Hopkins Appendix E, which has a lot of these pieces in it. It needs to have a clearly written purpose. There needs to be congruency or agreement between that purpose or research question, the methods we use to get our data, and then how we interpret our data. Everything has to always point back to that question, not unlike our literature review PICOT question, right? There also has to be a very clear methodology. I know qualitative research seems more messy and that there's kind of all over the place data collection, but it's actually a very clear process. We also need to create that rich, thick description using the data that we've gotten to fully describe the phenomenon. We also need to look at data saturation. Did we collect enough data? Did we go back to the data and collect more if we didn't have enough? Did we reflect? That's reflexivity. Did we reflect on the information that we got and have that back and forth process of reflecting, looking at the data, reflecting some more? Did we bracket and set aside the positionality of the researchers? In other words, did I say what I'm coming to this research with? What's my bias? And then how might I set that aside as I'm approaching the research? And then how am I verifying? Did I triangulate with various data sources? Did I validate my responses by maybe doing some member checking or by going to some other researchers? Did I, once I finished my analysis, get an independent review? Did someone else come in and say, okay, so I'm coming with my bias. Maybe I get someone who has a different bias or less of a bias regarding the topic. Do they see the same things that I'm seeing when they review the data? So it's actually very helpful to have a large team of researchers when you're doing qualitative data. And then you also want to document the researcher's process or keep an audit trail. When did you do what? How did you compare? Who did you go to? Who did what as part of the process? That audit trail becomes a very important piece of your data in qualitative research. Okay, I already mentioned Johns Hopkins Appendix E. That has a lot of the pieces that describe what we just talked about. Now it's going to be your turn. We're going to use a Google slide deck for you guys to look at these things more in depth using some articles as examples and trying your hand at applying that Johns Hopkins E to some actual articles in occupational therapy. Thanks a lot.